All right, greetings. This is a test of using YouTube as the recording device for a Zoom webinar. My name is John Bowers, and what I'm going to be doing today is sharing with you the creative foundations of church planting. I want to just start with a quote from Tim Keller. Tim Keller is a pastor of Redeemer Presbyterian Church in New York City, and he's been part of a movement to see churches planted in major urban centers all around the world. And one of his quotes here is that the vigorous continual planting of new congregations is the single most crucial strategy for two reasons at least: the numerical growth of the body of Christ in any city, and secondly, the continual corporate renewal and revival of the existing churches in a city. And so what we find here in this quote is both the expectation and the hope that many people would come to faith in Jesus Christ, but also that church planting is an important strategy for the renewal of the established church itself. But what do we mean by church planting? Because I think we all have our own vision. One of the excuses or one of the justifications here in Keller's quote could be added would be imagining cultural renewal. And that's certainly in the heart of Tim Keller. And you see in this vision, this picture of trees having been planted and growing all around this one place. It's a powerful, exciting vision of gospel transformation. But the churches we imagine being planted look less like this, which is actually a picture of one of the largest organisms in the world, all identical trees, all somehow becoming one organism together. But the churches we want you to imagine today as a church, as a potential planter, look less like this and more like this. A diversity of different plants spreading out across the landscape. The diversity of church planters and the variety of churches they plant are unlimited. They are unlimited. Limited not by God, but often limited by our own imagination. Look at how God created all things in Genesis 1 and 2. That there is a diversity of plants, a diversity of people, diversity of genders. And by the end of the Bible, in the book of Revelation, we see a diversity of nations, people from all races, tribes, and languages coming before the throne of the King of Kings. So diversity and imagination are an important facet of the kind of church planting movement we want to see. And we want you to imagine as a church, not just one maybe caricature of what a church is, but rather that there are many different types. And I'm going to share with you 15 creative ways that churches are planted already today. Now, the one, which is the typical caricature, is what we would call the parachute. And that's dropping a planter into a new community that he's never been a part of before in his or her life and starting from scratch. Now, this has advantages. That means you can plant anywhere. You just give someone a plane ticket to somewhere and maybe far from any other CRC church, and they go and plant. You can reach new areas and there's no inhibition. But the problem with this, the disadvantage of such a vision, is that it's very expensive to be able to pay a planter to go to some distant place. And year after year, there are these costs. And having to begin from scratch is a very low success rate. And it demands a particular kind of very much out there on the fringe, powerful leader to do this. And so what we found, certainly in recent years, that this often caricature of church planting is the most challenging and the least successful form. But there are other ways that new churches can be created. A second way is what we call team migration. That's where you have a gathering of Christian leaders and members who pick up, grab all their stuff, and they move to this new community. And you're looking for group sizes of between 5 and 30 people. Again, it's very similar to the parachute idea. It allows ministry to be expanded to new areas. It brings capable leaders all in one place, and starting a team is one of the most difficult things about church planting. There's strong emotional and financial support, whereas a parachute planter is often all by herself or himself. And you start with a very large base. So this is a great opportunity. But this is challenging in itself, to find a group with the freedom and willingness to migrate. And of course, they also suffer the same challenge as a parachute planter in that they also don't really know anybody in the area. For example, right here in Milton, there is a group that moved from the north, from Sudbury, with a vision to come together as a team to plant a church in Milton. So it can be done, and it is better success rate than the parachute, but it has its own advantages and disadvantages. A third way that a church could see a plant happen, and that's if you have a larger congregation of 300 or more members who hires a planter for about 9 months, and they gather a group from within the congregation who are sort of drawn to this vision of planting a new church, usually somewhat in the same area. So you don't have the same challenges as with the group migration. And so you would leave with groups of 30 to more than 200 people. We see this as an example that's happened with Forest City Community Church, who sort of brought, Vital Point Church, who has now hived off a group in Exeter, Ontario from North London. The advantages are you start with a sizable starter congregation. There's a very high success rate because there's a strong DNA of the larger congregation. It becomes independent very quickly, and there's good, strong ties of support between the parent and the plant. The one advantage or disadvantage or challenge that churches have to work through is that they could lose a chunk of often they're more motivated and inspired leaders. But of course, the flip side is that allows other leaders to step forward. So high success rate, and just a wonderful way for you to consider that you could see a new church being planted. Multi-site, sort of a different variation of the last two, in which a parent church starts a congregation at a new location in the same region. It remains under the leadership of the parent church long term. And again, that's kind of what we see at Vital Point Church in North London, where you have the central site, but you have another site in Exeter, and there's a strong interconnection between the two. The benefit is the cost is fairly low, quite a high success rate, 85%. It allows you to target other neighborhoods and particular maybe people groups or demographics that you don't or couldn't do in your main location. And it doesn't need a lot of kind of the peripheries of administration and leadership teams because it's shared by the main site. The challenges or the disadvantages are you need a really strong communicator to coordinate between the two sites to keep them all on the same page. But there is also the risk of a parent trying to make the new location too much like the main location, because of course now we're trying to plant in a new area, and it's going to start to take on its own DNA based on the context of the plant itself. Again, another variation of this is what we call the satellite venue to spinoff. An existing church opens new locations, but these sites eventually start to take on their own character and eventually become a distinct congregation. So this is maybe a bit of a moving away of the two, sort of the idea of two different sites becoming their own reality. Maybe one example of this would be Forest City Community Church, which sent Ron Baker to North London to what eventually became Vital Point and became two distinct congregations and churches. But it allows for this advantage-wise gradual time of testing and a time for a timeline. It fosters consistent branding in the process. But then again, the same sort of disadvantages of that tension between the parent and the child. There can be some restriction of movement forward. Number 6, adoption. A parent and its classes adopt an independent plant that wants to join the Christian Reformed Church. It has its advantages. It's low cost because the plant is already set up and already ready to grow. There's an opportunity for the church to become more diverse because of this adoption of maybe possibly a more diverse collection of Christians. And it's a good option for a smaller congregation that wants to parent a plant. So just being an adopting site. An example of this would be Emmanuel Church in Brampton, who has now La Roca Church, which is a Spanish congregation, as part of their church. The disadvantages, the new church has its own history and leadership. And so when you bring two cultures together, whether that be ethnic or even ecclesiological, whether that's a church culture, there are challenges that arise. And of course, there might be an educational difference between the two. So there's work of bringing these two adopted cultures together. Now we're moving off in a bit of a different direction where of a more organic form of church planting. And the first we want to describe is the simple church network. Smaller cell groups, so you imagine 8 to 15 people, they multiply into a network of organic churches. These groups are usually made up of 5 to 20 people. So the advantages are these simple church networks, I would say probably house church networks. They're low cost, high member participation, mobility, you can move into new areas, and often discipleship and relationship are much deeper in these cell groups themselves. The disadvantages of just simply a network, in the sense that there's not really a combined real sense of being one together. The groups remain small and isolated unless there's strong leadership that brings the network together. Not everyone is ready to let go of conventional ideas and expectations about church. I mean, people that come to this, all of a sudden start to miss that larger worship gathering and some of the advantages of being a larger, united congregation. And also, it's more challenging for denominational imagination. So this is a simple church network, a network of cell groups. Missional communities. Now we're imagining larger groups of people who are faith communities. Sometimes they call themselves a family on mission, who are really focused on discipleship and mission. They've come together in a neighborhood or to reach a particular demographic. And you may have, as they multiply, that these groups, these missional communities, these larger groups might want to meet together for corporate worship over time. The advantages of this missional community model is that serving Christ by serving others spurs personal and communal spiritual growth. So that discipleship, that holistic discipleship, is really critical to what is a missional community. And because it's larger, it's maybe less discouraging sometimes than when you have a small group and then half the people don't show up and now there's 2 or 3 people. Having a larger group, a larger cell, if you will, has its real advantages. The challenges are that you need a larger space than a typical home. If you want to have 40 or 30 or even 50 people meeting together, you need a fairly large home to do that. And multiplication itself remains a challenge. Even though this is a very strong model that's being used in many different places, there's still some learning and wisdom remaining to be figured out based on how to multiply. How is this multiplied? Because you might have one strong leader in one missional community, but now you need another strong leader for the next one. So leadership development is really key for this model. Sponsoring church host campus. A parent church invites a new church to start on its campus. The startup is often made up of people from different language groups or economic class. This again is sort of some variation of what's happening at Emmanuel Brampton. It allows access to low-cost facilities and can save a plant thousands of dollars by just allowing the congregation to use your space. Actually, also in Whitby, there is a combined sponsoring campus idea there in a number of different congregations. We see this. The parent church doesn't have to give up members for a plant because it's a distinct group of people. And it really maximizes our spaces. Many of us have these very expensive buildings that are being heated and maintained, and having more than one church in one place is really important and just very stewardly. The disadvantages of this is that, yeah, there's tensions that arise in these cultural gaps between the two congregations, and negotiating that, working for communication is key, so that confusion and frustration does not sit in. Awesome opportunity for an established church, maybe with not even a lot of its own resources, to be partnering with a church plant to see that happen. Cell celebration model. This takes combines aspect of the cell church with a congregational model. Planter starts a church through multiplying neighborhood cell groups. These are the smaller groups. And these move eventually over time from monthly private worship in 1 to 4 cells to weekly private worship in 5 to 8 cells. And ultimately they progress to weekly public worship in 9 or more cells. It bridges the gap between the congregational model and the early church model of a network of house churches mentioned earlier. It's a more effective approach for reaching the unchurched people than conventional models. But again, multiplying these cell groups, these smaller groups, is a challenge. And then, of course, children's ministry in smaller groups of 10 or 12 is difficult, because you might have 1 or 2 children in a group of this size. Fresh start. This is becoming more and more something to consider in the church today, where some congregations, through a variety of different parts of their story, have shrunk down in size and increased in age, and they don't feel very missional and very frustrated. And so one option is, and this is strongly endorsed, that if a congregation closes, that they have a plan to to release their building, to release their facilities to a new congregation. This is probably, and we're going to cover a couple of different variations of this. This is probably the quickest and easiest way of bringing revitalization, is totally releasing, like ending one congregation and starting a new one. And the benefit, of course, is that you get to leave a legacy instead of just closing the building and it gets used for some other purpose. But of course, the disadvantage is that a congregation dies. That's a very difficult process for a congregation to go, because it doesn't feel faithful, even though it really is being very stewardly with the use of property. So it's very difficult for everyone involved. Another variation of this, where you have a congregation that is shrinking and struggling, is to bring in a new leader and to sort of create a new mission. Often could involve a name change or even a location. The benefits is that you may have a committed core of people that just want to see something new and radical happen, and need to really kind of let go of the reins, but participate in the mission. And it allows you kind of, in some ways, to have a bit of a restart, but the congregation continues, but under the leadership of a planter. So basically the council would probably cease to exist, and you would operate like a church plant, where the church planter is the leader and the carrier of the vision. The challenge is it needs courageous new leadership and good coaching. It is much more difficult than the complete ending of a congregation. But this is another option for churches who have maybe the spirit of really releasing their facilities to a new church. There's an example of this in St. Catharines, where the council basically said, hey, we need to release this to a younger group of leaders. The whole council basically retired, and a young group of leaders, basically acting as plants, relaunched this church, and it's one of the most successful churches now in St. Catharines area. But yeah, there's problems, and the success rate is not as high as simply ending a congregation. Turnaround church. This is where a church has brought new leadership to a dying congregation. And what happens is that a whole new group of people come and join this congregation, and it starts to shift and often becomes much more multicultural. So this is a good option for churches that are have maybe seen the demographics of a neighborhood change, and to see that being transformed and revitalized through new leadership can be just another way of seeing a new church rise from an old one. But again, we still have these disadvantages of the previous leadership leaving their church behind. Catalytic missionary planter. This is very rare today, but it really reflects the biblical story of the Apostle Paul, who, and we see this all around the world today, where you see this catalytic missionary planter who just goes from place to place. He comes in and he plants a church, gets it going, and then he goes and leaves in a very short amount of time, plants another church, and then gets that stabilized, then plants another church and another church. These apostolic leaders are out there, and this is, again, a powerful way that churches are planted all around the world. It can be very expensive if it's a one-off, plant idea, because you need to pay someone full-time to be this invested and this engaged in just starting from scratch. And of course, it requires classical support. The final area is this apostolic regional missionary, the idea of a leader or a team of leaders overseeing a regional multiplication movement. The leader recruits and coaches planters through the process. It's described as very advantageous. You have a faster focus on training and harvesting. You can plant a number of churches a year. In fact, this is the vision of the Church Planting Institute, to ask the question, what would it take in Eastern Canada to see our churches, 3 to 5 churches being planted per year? So it can be very expensive. You paid someone full-time, or if, as we're doing it with fairly low salary, we have a team of planters who are invested in this, that together are seeing and desiring to see a movement of plants all around Eastern Canada. All right, so that's really the end of what we're doing here. And if you have questions, please message that to us, and we'd love to hear from you. Take time to look at the handouts, and we'll encourage you to consider, as a planter, which one of these models do you see yourself drawn towards? What are some of the things that struck you as a planter or as a church? As a church who thinks, man, maybe you thought at first we could not plant churches, but in these models, every church, I believe, could imagine themselves planting a new church, whether you're a small church or a big church, an old church or a young church, a dying church in your view, or a one that's kind of struggling. Anyone